The city street buzzed like any other afternoon, until the laughter of two uniformed police officers cut through the cries of a small black girl standing alone on the sidewalk. Tears streamed down her face as she searched for her mother, but instead of help, she got smirks and cruel words. One officer even stepped closer, hands twitching with threat. But before they could lay a finger on her, the girl did the only thing she could. She called out, "Mama!" And out of the crowd, a force rose. Boots slammed the pavement. A tall, fierce figure in a black Marine uniform marched forward. Her face was all fire and focus. That wasn't just a mother. That was a warrior. And she wasn't here to talk. She was here to protect. On a busy downtown sidewalk, under a gray sky that felt heavy with silence, a little black girl stood alone, no more than 7 years old, trembling, tears tracing clean lines down her cheeks. She clutched a small stuffed animal like a shield, eyes darting between the crowd for one familiar face, her mother. People passed by, indifferent. But not everyone ignored her. 2 police officers standing nearby, both tall and cocky in their stance, noticed the girl, not with concern but with mockery. One elbowed the other, chuckling under his breath, and said loud enough to be heard, "What's the matter, little girl? Lose your crackhead mom?" The other laughed, shaking his head. Bet she just wants to start drama like they always do. They didn't see a child. They didn't see innocence. They saw someone they thought they could belittle. The girl, scared but not silent, whispered into a small smartwatch on her wrist, "Mommy, they're being mean. I'm scared." Moments. Later, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the crosswalk. Heads turned. There, slicing through the crowd like a blade, came her mother, Staff Sergeant Delilah Ross. Black Marine. Decorated combat veteran. A woman with a chest full of ribbons and a heart full of fire. She wore her Marine uniform like armor, and her eyes locked onto the officers with unflinching precision. People stepped aside without being asked. Her presence was undeniable. The officers turned just as she reached them, clearly expecting a panicked civilian mother. What they got was a storm wrapped in discipline. Without a word, Delilah positioned herself between the officers and her daughter, who immediately clung to her leg. One of the officers raised a dismissive hand. "Ma'am, you can't—" But he didn't finish. Delilah's voice cut through him. "You laughed at a child, mocked her, threatened her, because of the color of her skin. Now you're going to answer for that." The officer scoffed, but his partner shifted uneasily. By now, a crowd had begun to form. Phones were up. People were filming. No one was laughing anymore. Delilah didn't yell. She didn't need to. She slowly reached into her jacket, pulled out her military ID, and held it an inch from their faces. "You disrespected a child of a United States Marine. You disgraced your badge in public." Her voice, calm and commanding, carried across the street. "I've stared down men with guns and more honor than you've shown in the last 5 minutes." A voice from the crowd suddenly called out, "She's a Marine," followed by murmurs of support. Then something unexpected happened. An older officer who had been watching from a distance stepped forward. His uniform bore silver stripes and decades of service. He removed his hat, glanced at the girl, then at Delilah, and nodded. "Sergeant Ross," he said with respect, "I saw everything. These two will be handled. I apologize on behalf of this department." The 2 younger officers tried to shrink into the background, faces red with shame. The older officer knelt beside the girl and said softly, "You're very brave, and your mama is a hero." Delilah knelt too, wrapping her arms around her daughter as she finally broke into sobs of relief. She whispered, "I'm here, and no one will ever hurt you, as long as I'm breathing." By now the crowd was clapping, not just for justice, but for strength, for a mother who became a shield, for a child who knew who to call, for a world that, even when it failed, was forced to witness what dignity and power look like. As Delilah walked away, daughter in her arms, not a single soul dared to mock them again. She hadn't just defended her child. She had reminded everyone watching what it means to serve, not just in war, but in everyday battles for humanity. As Delilah turned the corner with her daughter safely in her arms, the crowd slowly dispersed. But the moment burned in the minds of everyone who had seen it. Whispers rippled through the streets, voices repeating what had just unfolded like gospel. "She's a Marine. She stood up for her baby. Did you see those cops back down?" One by one, people who had remained silent during the confrontation began speaking up. A young black boy tugged at his father's sleeve and said, "She looks like a superhero." The father, eyes glassy, nodded and replied, "That's because she is." Meanwhile, back at the station, the two disgraced officers were summoned into the captain's office. The video of their behavior had already gone viral, shared across social media under hashtags like Chalk Marine Mom, Chalk Protect Black Children, and Real Hero. Their badges were pulled for suspension pending investigation. Public pressure mounted fast, and even the mayor's office issued a statement. "There is no place in this city for discrimination or cruelty, especially toward a child." Staff Sergeant Delilah Ross reminded us of what true strength and leadership look like. But Delilah wasn't concerned with news cycles. Her focus was on her daughter. They sat quietly at home now, curled up on the couch beneath an old Marine Corps blanket. Her daughter, still shaken, looked up and asked softly, "Why did they laugh at me?" Delilah's heart broke, but she didn't flinch. She tucked a strand of hair behind her child's ear and said, "Because sometimes people fear what they don't understand. But you are powerful and beautiful and worth protecting. And you don't ever let anyone make you feel small again. You hear me?" Her daughter nodded, and for the first time all day, smiled. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. Delilah opened it to find a group of neighbors, black, white, Asian, Latino, all holding homemade cards and stuffed animals. One woman stepped forward, voice soft but certain. "We saw what happened. We just wanted to say thank you for what you did, for reminding us." Delilah was speechless. Her daughter came to the door, eyes wide with surprise, as one of the kids handed her a teddy bear in a mini Marine outfit. It didn't stop there. The next week, Delilah was invited to speak at a citywide youth assembly about courage and standing up for others. She told the story, not with anger, but with clarity and compassion. She ended with words that echoed across the auditorium. "It doesn't take a uniform to be brave. It just takes love. Love that stands tall when hate tries to shrink you." Applause thundered. Her daughter sat in the front row, shoulders straighter than they'd ever been. She looked up at her mother not just as a parent, but as a legend. And across the city, in homes and schools and offices, people remembered that moment. The moment a little girl cried out for her mother, and the world watched justice arrive in boots, medals shining, with love in one hand and strength in the other. Because that day wasn't just about stopping two bad cops. It was about awakening, a community, and honoring a truth. When black mothers rise, they don't rise alone. They carry generations with them, and they teach the world, one righteous stand at a time, that real power doesn't wear a badge. Real power wears love like armor. Days turned into weeks, but the story of the little girl and her Marine mother didn't fade. It grew, like a wildfire of hope in a world too often burned by injustice. News outlets reached out, but Delilah turned, most of them down. She wasn't looking for fame. She didn't need applause. She already had what mattered most, her daughter's trust and her community's awakening. Still, one invitation stood out. A principal from a local elementary school asked if Delilah would visit and talk to the students about courage. At first, she hesitated, unsure if her uniform would be a source of strength or trigger for fear. But her daughter, sitting on her lap that night, whispered, "Mom, you can make them feel safe like you made me feel safe." That was all the reason Delilah needed. When she arrived at the school, the entire auditorium stood in silence. Students, teachers, janitors, everyone rose. Her daughter walked beside her, now proud and radiant, hand in hand with the woman who showed the world what a mother's love in combat boots looked like. Delilah took the stage and looked out over a sea of young, eager, and wounded faces. Faces that too often went unheard. "I didn't come here to tell you I'm a hero," she said softly. "I came to tell you you are. You who've been made fun of for your hair, your skin, your accent. You who've felt small. You are not small. You are rising, and you are not alone." She paused, then added, "That day, when I found my daughter crying, what I did wasn't just about her. It was about every child who's ever felt invisible. Every child who's ever been told they don't matter. I wore my uniform, but that didn't make me strong. What made me strong was love. Love for my child. Love for every child. Love is a weapon the world can't disarm." The room erupted in applause, but the moment that followed was even more powerful. One by one, students began raising their hands. Not with questions, but with stories. One boy shared how he was bullied for his accent. A girl said she'd been told she was too dark to be pretty. A mixed-race child spoke about feeling like they didn't belong anywhere. Delilah didn't interrupt. She listened. And then she did something unexpected. She stepped down from the stage, sat among them on the floor, and listened more. She wasn't a speaker now. She was one of them. Word continued to spread. Donations poured into a fund that had been started by a veterans group to support Delilah's daughter and other kids who had experienced racial trauma. A scholarship was created in the girl's name for young black girls pursuing leadership and service. Eventually, Delilah was invited to Capitol Hill to speak on police reform and child safety in public spaces. She stood tall before lawmakers and said, "The problem is not just the badge, it's the silence behind it. If we don't protect the smallest voices, then the loudest ones will continue to cause harm. And that's a war we cannot lose." One representative stood and saluted her before leaving the chamber in tears. And yet, despite all the attention, Delilah remained grounded. She still packed her daughter's lunch each morning, kissed her forehead before school, and read to her every night. The world may have called her a warrior, but to her daughter, she was simply Mom, the woman who came when she was afraid, who stood up when others backed down, who made the whole world stop to protect a little girl's tears. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, her daughter said, "Mom, I want to be like you one day." Delilah smiled. "No," she replied. "You'll be even stronger. You won't have to fight the same battles, because by the time you grow up, we'll have already won them." And in that moment, beneath a sky turning gold, two generations sat side by side, one forged by fire, the other rising like light. The legacy was sealed. Not with medals, not with headlines, but with the simple, eternal truth. A mother's love, when brave enough to rise, becomes a shield the world cannot break. The seasons began to shift, summer melting into autumn, and with it came a subtle but lasting change in the neighborhood. Where once there had been quiet discomfort, now there was connection. The street where the little girl had been mocked was transformed into a mural wall. Artists, young and old, came together and painted a tribute, a larger-than-life image of Delilah in her marine dress blues, standing protectively over a child, one hand outstretched not in violence, but in defense. Around her bloomed the names of girls and boys from the neighborhood, written in vibrant colors, as if declaring to the world, "We matter." Every weekend, families gathered beneath that mural. Some brought food, others brought music. Kids rode bikes, laughter echoed. And where there was once fear, there was now rhythm and freedom. Delilah never asked for that. She didn't expect to be painted on a wall. But every time she walked by, holding her daughter's hand, She saw more than just her own face. She saw a collective stand, a declaration, not again, not here, not to our children. The two officers who had laughed that day quietly left the force, one citing stress, the other simply disappeared into another city. But their exit didn't erase the damage they'd done, and Delilah knew that. She didn't celebrate their fall. Instead, she pushed for something better. She started a training initiative called Guardian Hearts, a program that trained police officers, teachers, and security guards on racial empathy, de-escalation, and the unique emotional needs of black children. At the first training session, she brought her daughter to speak. The little girl, once frozen in fear on a cold sidewalk, now stood before a room of uniformed adults and said with calm clarity, "You don't have to like me, but you have to protect me. That's your job. That's why you wear that badge." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Over the months, Delilah was offered job after job, consultant roles, interviews, political opportunities. But she turned most of them down. Her mission was local. Her power was in her neighborhood. She didn't want a podium. She wanted progress. And she got it. Her daughter's school changed too. They hired more black teachers. They brought in therapists trained in racial trauma. They held assemblies where kids could speak openly. And one day, when Delilah came to pick up her daughter, she saw something that stopped her heart in the best way. A young white teacher sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of black and brown children, listening as they told their stories. The mother, who had once come running in boots to stop harm, now walked calmly through hallways filled with understanding. She had kicked open the doors, and now others were holding them wide. Then came a letter. It arrived on crisp government stationery, with a gold seal at the top. Inside was an invitation. The President of the United States wished to award staff Sergeant Delilah Ross with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her service to the country and her courage in the face of injustice. Delilah stared at it for a long time. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from deep-rooted humility. That night, she sat down with her daughter under a blanket of stars and read the letter aloud. Her daughter leaned against her and whispered, "You're going to wear a medal?" Delilah smiled. "I already do," she said, placing her hand on her daughter's chest. "You." A few weeks later, she stood on a national stage, cameras flashing, the world watching. As the president pinned the medal on her chest, the crowd rose to its feet. But Delilah's eyes didn't search for approval. They searched for one face, the girl in the front row, beaming, fists tucked under her chin, proud beyond words. And in that moment, the world finally understood what some of them had missed that day on the sidewalk. This was never just about a mother and her child. It was about every parent who has ever feared for their child's safety. It was about every little black girl who cried and wasn't heard. It was about what happens when love refuses to back down, because love, real love, isn't soft. It's armor. It's voice. It's justice with boots on the ground. And in a country that sometimes forgets who it belongs to, a Marine mother and her brave daughter reminded everyone, "We are here. We rise. And we will never walk away from the children who need us." The spotlight. Faded as all spotlights do, but the legacy Delilah and her daughter carved into the heart of their community only grew deeper. With the medal tucked away in a modest frame on their living room wall, they returned to their rhythm, not of fame, but of purpose. Delilah resumed her early morning runs through the neighborhood, her boots pounding the pavement with the same determination she once carried through war zones. She greeted neighbors by name, helped carry groceries for elders, and hosted Saturday community breakfast circles where kids and parents could sit down, speak freely, and simply be heard. One morning, as she passed the mural of herself and her daughter, Delilah noticed a new addition. Someone had painted words in elegant gold script beneath their feet. They tried to silence a child. Instead, they awakened a warrior. She stood there for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across her face, before continuing her jog, stronger than ever. Meanwhile, her daughter, now growing into a confident, curious young girl, found herself being looked up to by others. Children came to her with stories they hadn't told anyone else. One boy whispered about being followed in a store. Another girl admitted that her teacher always seemed to ignore her hand in class, and her daughter, only 7, but full of grace, passed down through generations, would listen carefully, hold their hands, and say the words her mother had taught her. You are not wrong. You are not invisible, and you are never alone. Empowered by her mother's courage, she started a school group called Little Shields. What began with 5 kids sitting under a tree during recess became a movement, dozens of children, of all colors coming together each week to talk about fairness, kindness, and what it means to stand up, even when your voice shakes. Delilah continued her work too, not in big speeches or grand marches, but in quiet revolutions. She trained school security across the state, she wrote children's books about bravery, and she worked with lawmakers behind the scenes to write new policy that ensured every officer, teacher, and civil servant underwent trauma-informed and anti-bias training. And when reporters asked her why she kept going, she always gave the same answer. Because there are still kids crying alone. And I promised I'd never let them cry alone again. Years passed. The city changed. The children grew. And on the 10th anniversary of the day her daughter had cried out on that sidewalk, the community held a candlelight vigil. Not one of mourning, but of remembrance, of honor, and of unity. Hundreds gathered in front of the mural, which by now had become sacred ground. And standing at the front, tall and glowing in her high school graduation robe, was Delilah's daughter. She took the microphone, now a poised and powerful young woman, and said, 10 years ago I called out for my mom. Today, I speak for every child still waiting for someone to come. My mom didn't just protect me. She showed the world that protecting black children isn't a luxury. It's a duty. It's a promise. And we're keeping that promise. Crowd erupted in cheers, some in tears, others simply holding hands in silent thanks. Delilah, standing a few feet away, wiped a tear from her eye. But she didn't move to the stage. She didn't need to. Her daughter had taken the lead, and that, more than medals or news headlines, was her victory. Because true heroism doesn't just stop the hurt once, it creates ripples of healing that stretch into the future. It teaches others to rise, to speak, to protect. And long after the uniforms are hung up and the noise dies down, what remains is the strength passed from one heart to another. That day on the sidewalk became a legend not because of violence but because of love, a mother's love, a child's cry, and a world that finally listened. And from that love, a new generation rose, stronger, louder, and utterly unafraid to demand a world where every child can cry without fear, because now someone will come running. And still, the story continued. Quietly, powerfully, like the roots of a tree growing deeper even after the branches have reached the sky. Delilah, now older, carried a new kind of strength, not the urgent adrenaline-fueled force of a Marine racing to her daughter's call, but the calm, enduring strength of a mother who had already changed the course of countless lives. She had become a mentor, not just to young women entering the military, but to mothers, social workers, teachers, even young police recruits who sought her wisdom, not because of what she wore, but because of what she had done. People said she spoke like soil, her voice rich, grounding, filled with generations of memory and meaning. Her home had become a gathering place, filled with laughter, shared meals, and difficult conversations that always ended in hugs or healing. Her daughter, now in college on a full scholarship, studied law and child psychology. Her goal? To protect Kids not only in the streets but in courtrooms, schools, and systems that had too often failed them. She interned with civil rights organizations by day and led community town halls by night. But even as she rose, she never forgot that afternoon on the sidewalk. The moment her innocence was threatened, and her mother became her shield. One summer evening, the two of them sat on their porch watching children ride bikes past the mural, now retouched each year by a new generation of artists. A little girl pedaled past, stopped, pointed to the mural and said to her dad, "That's the lady who made the police be nice." The dad smiled and corrected her gently. "No, sweetheart. That's the lady who reminded everyone we're supposed to care." Delilah chuckled. "I never thought I'd be a mural," she said. Her daughter smirked. "You never thought you'd be famous for kicking bigots either." They both laughed, but behind the humor was something bigger. A deep, unshakable bond that had changed the world, one act of fierce love at a time. And far beyond their street, across the country, stories like theirs began to unfold. A teacher who stood up for a bullied black student said she thought of the Marine mom when she made her decision. A young man stopped by a cop, for no reason remembered what he learned from the Little Shields Club, and filmed the interaction peacefully, but firmly. A mayor, once silent on police reform, quoted Delilah's words in a speech about new training legislation. "If we don't protect the smallest voices, the loudest ones will continue to cause harm." Her voice had become woven into the national dialogue, not as a celebrity, but as a compass, a reminder, a standard. And then one day, as life would have it, a new cry echoed from another child in another town. This time, the response was immediate. Not one mother came running, dozens did. Teachers stepped forward, neighbors intervened, officers paused, listened, apologized. It wasn't perfect, but it was proof. The world was learning, because the cry of a little black girl on a sidewalk didn't just call her mother that day. It called a movement into being, and that movement, rooted in love, raised in courage, and watered by truth, would go on to outlive them all, forever. Years rolled, on like soft thunder beneath the surface of time, but the story of the Marine mother and her daughter never faded. It became a seed planted in the hearts of a generation, quietly passed down in classrooms, whispered during bedtime stories, cited in college theses, and reflected in murals, documentaries, and movements alike. Delilah, now with silver woven, through her once dark curls had become something rare, a living legend who never asked to be one. She still walked with purpose, though a cane now accompanied her steps. People still stopped her on the street, not out of fanfare, but reverence. Sometimes it was a mother, sometimes a soldier, sometimes a child who had once cried alone but no longer did. They all said the same thing. "Because of you, something changed." Her daughter, now a civil rights attorney, led a national initiative that combined youth protection with judicial reform. She often walked into rooms filled with suits and skepticism. But every time she spoke, she echoed the fire her mother once carried into a war zone, then later into a sidewalk confrontation, and finally into the soul of a nation. One day, as part of an annual honor for changemakers, her daughter was invited to speak at the United Nations. As she took the podium, the world watched, streaming live from every corner of the earth. She stood tall, shoulders squared in a white blazer with a golden marine pin that once belonged to her mother resting over her heart. And she spoke. "When I was 7, I cried out for help." 2 men laughed. One woman answered, "My mother didn't just protect me, she rewrote what protection means. She showed the world that a black woman in uniform isn't just a defender of a country, but of dignity, of justice, of a child's right to be safe in her own skin." That moment shaped me. But what came after, how you chose to remember it, that shaped all of you. She paused, let the silence carry the weight. You want to change the world? Start by answering the cries you've ignored. Answer them with love. Answer them with action. Answer them like my mother did, with boots, backbone, and boundless love. The audience stood. Many cried. Some, for the first time, truly saw. Back home, Delilah sat watching the live broadcast on a worn couch, her cane resting beside her and a hand pressed lightly to her heart. She didn't cry. She didn't smile wide. She just nodded. Quiet, steady, fulfilled. That night, the city renamed the street where it all began. A simple bronze plaque was mounted beneath the mural, and the intersection was christened Sergeant Delilah Ross Way, where courage answered the call. And still, children walked by that corner. Still they played. Still they pointed to the mural and asked, who was she? And the answer, forever and always, came with pride. She was a mother who heard a cry and stood so tall the world had to rise with her. And thus, her legacy didn't end. It simply continued, as all the greatest legacies do, not in the roar of crowds, but in the quiet certainty that love, when brave enough to stand, becomes immortal. And so it was that Delilah Ross became more than just a name. She became a symbol, not a cold carved statue that people walked past without notice, but a living flame passed hand to hand, generation to generation. Her story was told in classrooms, acted out in school plays, etched into public murals across cities, and woven into the lyrics of protest songs that echoed through streets from Chicago to Cape Town. Yet even with the rising reverence, Delilah never lived for legacy. She lived for moments. Like the moment she watched her daughter, now a woman of fierce voice and measured grace, sit on the steps of the Supreme Court with a group of children surrounding her, listening as she read aloud from a picture book titled The Day Mommy Came. A book inspired by that cry on the sidewalk. A story that began in pain but was rewritten in power. Delilah sat at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She wasn't in the spotlight. She didn't need to be. She had already lit it. One day, a film crew approached her, hoping to make a feature-length documentary. She agreed on one condition, that the story not end with her. That it include every child who found their voice, every mother who rose in defense, every teacher who decided to protect instead of punish, every officer who changed because they chose to listen. When the film premiered, the cry that changed everything, it didn't just receive awards. It reignited action. School boards watched it. Police departments used it for training. Young girls watched it with their grandmothers and whispered, "That's who I want to be." And Delilah? She watched it just once in a quiet home screening with her daughter. When it ended, her daughter looked at her and asked, "Did you ever imagine all of this?" From that one day, Delilah chuckled softly. "I didn't imagine anything past getting to you. Everything after that. That's grace." In the final years of her life, she remained deeply rooted in her community. She still cooked for neighbors, still fixed her own coffee, still walked children to school when their parents had to work late shifts. She called it frontline duty. Then, on a calm morning painted in gold light, Delilah passed peacefully in her sleep. The news spread like a quiet storm. Flags were lowered. A spontaneous candlelight vigil filled the entire street named after her. Grown men who had once been those scared children stood with tears running down their cheeks. Mothers clutched daughters. Fathers hugged sons. The president gave a national address, calling Delilah a warrior of the spirit, a soldier of the soul, and a mother of a movement. Cities across the country held moments of silence, but the loudest tribute came not in the hush, but in the renewed action. New laws, new youth programs, and most of all, new promises spoken aloud. If a child cries, we answer. If injustice rises, we rise higher. At her funeral, her daughter gave the eulogy. She didn't read from notes. She simply stood tall, her voice calm, clear, unshaken. My mother didn't want to be remembered as a hero. She wanted to be remembered as a woman who refused to back down when love called her name. So if you remember her, don't do it in silence. Do it when you speak up. Do it when you intervene. Do it when you listen to a crying child and don't look away. Because that's who she was. Not just my mother, but all of ours. And so, in the echoes of playgrounds, the halls of justice, the murals of cities, and the hearts of every person who ever felt unseen, Delilah's story lived on, not because she changed the world in one moment, but because she changed the response to the moments we often overlook, and somewhere, in a future yet to come, when another child cries out, someone will answer. Because she did. Years passed, and time moved forward the way it always does, quietly, relentlessly. But the imprint of Delilah Ross never faded. In fact, it deepened. Entire school curriculums began using her story to teach children not just about racism or courage, but about response, about what it means to rise in a moment of truth when the world looks away. One school in Philadelphia created a classroom called the Shield Room, filled with books by Black authors, photos of changemakers, and a small bronze plaque on the wall that read, "When a child cried, she came. Be like her." Across the ocean, students in South Africa wrote letters to Delilah's daughter, telling her how her mother gave them the courage to speak up in their own schools. One girl ended her letter with, "If I ever have to choose between being quiet or being brave, I will remember your mom's boots." Meanwhile, the Guardian Hearts Initiative grew into a national non-profit, operating in all 50 states, training thousands of security guards, school staff, and law enforcement officers in child-centered protection, racial empathy, and non-violent crisis intervention. At every training session, they opened with a single sentence. This began because a little black girl cried, and the world learned to listen. Delilah's daughter, now a senior advisor in the U.S. Department of Justice, continued her mother's work with relentless devotion. She wore her mother's Marine pin every day, tucked under her jacket, next to her badge. She passed legislation protecting the rights of children in public spaces, ensuring that no child, black, brown, or otherwise, could be removed or mistreated, without full due process and visible accountability. But even with the career, the impact, the travel, every Sunday, without fail, she returned home. To the street named after her mother. To the house with the porch and the rocking chair and the soft humming of a past that never left. And on those quiet Sundays, she would sit outside with a cup of tea, and children from the neighborhood would gather on her steps. Some had been born long after Delilah's death. Some knew only the mural. But all of them felt her. They'd ask, is it true she fought people? Did she really kick a cop? Was she scared? What happened after? And Delilah's daughter would smile and say, she fought with love. She kicked down fear. She was scared, but she came anyway. And what happened after? She'd pause, look around at the faces glowing with curiosity and awe, then finish, you happened after. And they'd sit together in the sun, no headlines, no cameras, just one generation holding space for the next. Then one spring, on the 25th anniversary of the sidewalk incident, a statue was unveiled in Washington, D.C., just outside the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It showed Delilah in mid-step, her Marine uniform crisp, her head turned slightly back, one hand extended behind her, not in combat, but in invitation, as if reaching for her daughter, as if reaching for all of us. The inscription on the base read, Staff Sergeant Delilah Ross. She came when a child cried. She stood when others faltered. She answered a call that changed the world. Visitors from around the globe came to see it. Some knelt before it. Some left flowers, children's drawings, or little boots. Others simply stood in silence, hand on, heart, whispering thank you. And every so often, a child, black, brown, or white, would stop and ask, Mom, who was she? And the answer would come, like gospel. She was the reason we don't walk away anymore. Because in a world so quick to forget, so quick to pass by pain that doesn't look like ours, she remembered. She showed us how to hear a cry, how to step forward instead of back, how to raise love like a banner, and because of her, we do better now. We are better now. Because once, on a street like any other, a little girl cried, and someone brave enough came running. And still, her spirit marches, not in parades or parliaments, but in the quiet, everyday revolutions sparked by people who saw themselves in her story. A teacher who bends down to listen before sending a child out of class. A transit officer who chooses to de-escalate instead of dominate. A teenager who speaks up when her friend is mistreated. A father who kneels to comfort a child that isn't his, simply because it's right. In the ripple of her legacy, new leaders are born, not all in uniform, but all in purpose. Delilah Ross became more than a Marine, more than a mother, more than a moment caught on camera. She became memory made flesh, love made action, justice with a pulse. Her story doesn't belong to one family or one city anymore. It belongs to anyone who chooses to rise when silence would be easier. She taught us that one voice, no matter how small, can be the spark that calls an army of compassion. She proved that the strongest stand isn't always in battle, but in protection, in presence, in love that refuses to leave when it's needed most. And though she now rests, her voice still speaks through the lives she lifted, the laws she inspired, and the hearts she rewired. So the next time you hear a cry, don't pause. Don't wonder if it's your job. Don't wait for someone stronger to show up. Be the one who comes running. She answered one cry and changed the world forever. In a world that turned away, she stood. Now it's your turn. Don't scroll past this. Let her story move you to act. Because somewhere, right now, a child is crying. Will you be the one who comes running?